The summer heat pressed down on London's streets like a heavy blanket as tourists gathered around Buckingham Palace. Among the crowd stood Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old construction worker from Manchester who had come to the capital for what was supposed to be a celebratory weekend with his mates. 3 days earlier, Marcus had received news that would change everything. His girlfriend of 4 years, Sarah, had been cheating on him with his best friend. The betrayal cut deep, and Marcus had been drowning his sorrows in alcohol ever since. Walking through the palace gates area, Marcus clutched a half-empty beer bottle in his sweaty palm. His bloodshot eyes scanned the perfectly aligned royal guard standing motionless in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats. To most visitors, these guards represented tradition, honor, and unwavering dedication to duty. But to Marcus, in his current state of mind, they symbolized everything he felt was fake and pretentious about the world around him. The guard closest to him was James Mitchell, a 24-year-old soldier who had been serving in the Queen's Guard for 2 years. James took immense pride in his role, understanding that his position required absolute discipline and composure regardless of what happened around him. He had endured countless provocations from tourists trying to make him laugh, move, or react. Children had poked him, adults had made faces, and some had even tried to touch his rifle. Through it all, James remained stone-faced and professional. Marcus stumbled slightly as he approached James, the alcohol making his movements unsteady. The crowd around him was typical for a Saturday afternoon. Families with excited children, pointing at the guards, elderly couples taking photos, and young backpackers snapping selfies. Nobody paid much attention to the disheveled man with the beer bottle, assuming he was just another tourist enjoying his visit to one of London's most famous landmarks. "Look at you," Marcus muttered under his breath, staring directly at James, standing there like you're better than everyone else, like you're some kind of hero. His words were slurred and spittle formed at the corners of his mouth. The pain of Sarah's betrayal had transformed into a burning rage that needed an outlet, and this silent, stoic figure in front of him seemed like the perfect target. James could hear every word, but remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight, ahead. He had been trained for situations like this. Drunk and disorderly individuals were not uncommon, and the protocol was clear: maintain position, ignore provocations, and trust that security personnel would handle any serious threats. James could see his fellow guards in his peripheral vision, all maintaining their posts with the same unwavering dedication. The crowd began to notice the tension building. Parents pulled their children a little closer, and several tourists started recording with their phones, sensing that something was about to happen. An elderly woman whispered to her husband that perhaps they should move away, while a group of teenagers positioned themselves to get a better view of what they assumed would be another failed attempt to break a guard's composure. Marcus raised the beer bottle, taking another long drink while never breaking eye contact with James. "You think you're so special, don't you? Standing there in your fancy costume like some kind of toy soldier. But you're just another fake, aren't you? Just like everyone else in this world." His voice grew louder with each word, causing more heads to turn in their direction. The security cameras positioned around the area were capturing everything, and palace security officers were already being alerted to the developing situation. However, they were stationed at various points around the complex, and reaching Marcus's exact location would take precious minutes. Meanwhile, the crowd continued to grow, drawn by the increasingly hostile confrontation between the intoxicated man and the silent guard. James's training kicked into overdrive as he assessed the threat level. The man was clearly intoxicated and agitated, holding what could potentially be used as a weapon. Yet James remained motionless, his breathing controlled and steady. He had faced challenging situations before during his military service, and this was just another test of his professionalism and dedication to duty. Marcus's anger reached a boiling point as he interpreted James's continued silence as arrogance and disrespect. The alcohol had clouded his judgment completely, and the emotional pain from his personal betrayal had morphed into an irrational need to provoke a reaction from this symbol of authority and control. "I'm talking to you," Marcus shouted, his voice carrying across the courtyard and causing tourists dozens of yards away to look in their direction. The moment stretched on like an eternity. Children in the crowd sensed the adults' tension and began to cry. Several tourists started backing away, unsure of what they were witnessing but instinctively knowing it wasn't going to end well. Others moved closer, their phones ready to capture whatever was about to unfold. The contrast was stark, chaos and unpredictability represented by Marcus, while order and discipline embodied by James. Without warning, Marcus raised the beer bottle high above his head. The glass caught the afternoon sunlight, creating a brief, almost beautiful glint before reality set in. Time seemed to slow as onlookers gasped and screamed. Some covered their children's eyes while others stood frozen in shock. The bottle descended with tremendous force, aimed directly at James's head. The sound of glass shattering against James's ceremonial hat echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. Beer and glass fragments scattered in all directions as the crowd erupted, in screams and chaos. Several people were struck by flying glass, and the smell of alcohol mixed with the metallic scent of blood filled the air. James staggered but somehow remained standing, blood beginning to seep through his ceremonial hat and down his face. His training had prepared him for many things, but the shock of the unprovoked attack sent adrenaline coursing through his system. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Some screamed in horror, others shouted for help, and many simply stood in stunned disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Marcus stood there for a moment, the broken bottleneck still in his hand, seemingly as shocked as everyone else by what he had just done. The alcohol-fueled rage that had driven him to this point suddenly evaporated, replaced by a dawning realization of the magnitude of his actions. Around him, the crowd's mood had shifted from curious entertainment to genuine fear and outrage. The aftermath of the bottle strike created a moment of absolute silence that seemed to stretch forever. Blood trickled down James Mitchell's face, mixing with perspiration and creating crimson streaks across his pale skin. His ceremonial hat had absorbed much of the impact, likely preventing a more serious head injury, but the force of the blow had left him dazed and struggling to maintain his composure. Marcus Thompson stood frozen, the jagged remains of the beer bottle still clutched in his trembling hand. The reality of what he had just done began to penetrate through the alcoholic haze that had clouded his judgment. Around him, the crowd's initial shock was rapidly transforming into something far more dangerous: collective outrage. "Someone call the police!" shouted an elderly man, his face red with indignation. "This is absolutely disgraceful." His wife was already dialing emergency services, her hands shaking as she tried to explain the situation to the operator. Other tourists began pulling out their phones, some to call for help and others to document the unfolding drama. A young mother pushed her children behind her, creating a protective barrier while screaming at Marcus, "How dare you, that's a soldier, serving his country." Her voice carried across the courtyard, galvanizing other onlookers who had been too stunned to react initially. The crowd's energy was shifting from shocked silence to barely contained fury. James fought to maintain his military bearing despite the pain radiating through his skull. His training had emphasized the importance of discipline under all circumstances. But this situation was testing every limit of his endurance. Blood was now flowing more freely, and he could feel his strength beginning to waver. Yet remarkably, he remained at attention, his rifle still properly positioned, his gaze still fixed straight ahead. Two teenage boys who had been recording the incident started shouting at Marcus, their voices cracking with emotion. "You coward! He can't even defend himself," one screamed while the other yelled. "What kind of man attacks someone who can't fight back?" Their words seemed to awaken something primal in the surrounding crowd, and the atmosphere grew increasingly threatening. Marcus finally dropped the broken bottle, the glass shattering further as it hit the pavement. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held him motionless, and he began looking around frantically at the faces surrounding him. What he saw there terrified him more than any potential legal consequences: genuine hatred from dozens of strangers who had witnessed his unprovoked attack on a defenseless soldier. "I didn't mean," Marcus began, his words slurred and barely coherent. But the crowd wasn't interested in his explanations or excuses. A middle-aged businessman stepped forward, his expensive suit contrasting sharply with his aggressive posture. "You attacked a man who couldn't fight back," he said, his voice deadly calm. That makes you the lowest kind of coward. More people began moving closer to Marcus, forming a tightening circle around him. Their faces showed a mixture of disgust, anger, and disbelief. An American tourist, a large man wearing a baseball cap, pointed directly at Marcus and shouted, "In my country, we'd sort you out right here and now." His comment received nods and murmurs of agreement from several others in the crowd. James, despite his injury and disorientation, began to realize that the situation was spiraling beyond the original assault. The crowd's mood was becoming increasingly volatile, and he could see that Marcus was now in genuine danger from the angry mob that was forming. His military training included crowd control scenarios, and he recognized the signs of a group about to turn violent. A group of young men, possibly university students, began chanting, "Shame, shame, shame," while pointing at Marcus. The rhythmic shouting was picked up by others, creating an intimidating wall of sound that seemed to press in on Marcus from all sides. He spun around desperately, looking for an escape route, but found himself surrounded by hostile faces wherever he looked. An elderly veteran, identifiable by his military service pins on his jacket, pushed through the crowd with surprising determination. His weathered face was set in hard lines as he approached. "Marcus, I served in 3 wars, you pathetic excuse for a man," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military experience. "And I've never seen anything as disgusting as what you just did." The crowd's anger was feeding on itself, growing stronger with each passing moment. Someone threw a plastic water bottle at Marcus, striking him in the shoulder. Another person kicked at his feet, trying to knock him down. The situation was rapidly deteriorating from a single act of violence into something much more dangerous. A mob mentality was taking hold. Marcus tried to back away, but everywhere he turned, there were more angry faces, more pointing fingers, more voices calling him names and demanding justice. "Please," he stammered, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." But his words were drowned out by the crowd's growing hostility. Someone pushed him hard from behind, causing him to stumble forward into another person who shoved him back. Through all of this chaos, James maintained his position despite the blood loss and obvious pain. His dedication to duty was absolute, even in the face of personal injury. However, he could see that the situation was becoming dangerous for everyone involved, including innocent bystanders who might get caught up in the mob's fury. A group of teenage girls had positioned themselves near James, trying to offer help despite his inability to accept it while on duty. One of them had tissues ready to help with the bleeding, while another was speaking soothingly, saying, "It's okay, soldier. Help is coming. You're doing great." Their compassion stood in stark contrast to the violence that had erupted around them. The crowd continued to press closer to Marcus, with more people arriving every moment as word spread about what had happened. Some newcomers demanded to know what was going on, and when they learned about the unprovoked attack on the guard, their anger only added fuel to the fire. The situation was becoming a powder keg, ready to explode into something far worse than the original incident. Marcus could feel the crowd's energy becoming more dangerous by the second. Hands were grabbing at his clothes, voices were becoming more threatening, and he realized with growing horror that he might not escape this situation unharmed. The guilt over what he had done to James was now competing with fear for his own safety as the mob mentality took hold of the gathering crowd. The crowd had transformed into something Marcus had never experienced before. A living, breathing entity fueled by righteous anger and collective outrage. Hands reached out to grab his shirt, voices screamed accusations in his ears, and faces, twisted with disgust, pressed closer from every direction. The circle around him had tightened to the point where he could barely move, trapped by dozens of furious tourists and locals who had witnessed his unprovoked attack. "You're going to pay for this," shouted a woman in her 50s, her face flushed, red with anger. She swung her heavy handbag at Marcus, connecting solidly with his ribs and causing him to grunt in pain. The blow seemed to encourage others, and suddenly hands were pushing, shoving, and striking him from multiple directions simultaneously. James Mitchell, despite the blood still flowing from his head wound, watched the scene unfolding with growing concern. His military training had taught him to assess threats and tactical situations, and what he was seeing now was a crowd on the verge of complete loss of control. The anger that had been directed at Marcus was spreading, becoming infectious, and drawing more people into its dangerous embrace. A group of construction workers who had been on their lunch break heard the commotion and arrived to see what was happening. When they learned that someone had attacked a royal guard, their reaction was immediate and visceral. "Where is the bastard?" one of them demanded, rolling up his sleeves as he scanned the crowd. His colleagues nodded grimly, ready to dispense their own form of justice. Marcus found himself being pushed and pulled in different directions as different groups in the crowd tried to get their hands on him. A businessman grabbed his left arm while a teenager seized his right, each pulling with enough force to nearly dislocate his shoulders. "Let us at him," someone screamed from the back of the crowd. "He needs to learn some respect." The situation had moved far beyond anything that could be considered justice or appropriate response. What had started as legitimate outrage over Marcus's assault on James was becoming mob violence, with innocent people potentially at risk as the crowd's fury grew beyond reason. Elderly tourists were being jostled and pushed as younger, more aggressive individuals forced their way toward the center of the action. Through the chaos, James made a decision that would surprise everyone present. Despite his injury, despite the blood loss, and despite every protocol that told him to maintain his position and await official assistance, he took a step forward. Then another. The crowd's attention shifted momentarily as they realized the injured guard was moving, breaking from his rigid stance for the first time. "Stop," James said, his voice cutting through the noise despite its relative quietness. The word carried such authority and unexpected compassion that several people in the immediate vicinity actually paused their assault on Marcus. "This has gone far enough." A burly man who had been preparing to throw a punch at Marcus turned toward James in confusion. "But he attacked you. He could have killed you." The man's voice carried genuine concern for the guard's welfare, but also a burning desire for revenge that many in the crowd shared. James took another step, putting himself between Marcus and the most aggressive members of the crowd. Blood continued to stream down his face, staining his pristine red uniform, but his voice remained steady and clear. "Yes, he attacked me. But I'm a soldier, and I didn't become a soldier to watch civilians tear each other apart in the streets." Crowd's momentum faltered as people struggled to process what they were witnessing. The very person who had been victimized was now protecting his attacker from their collective wrath. It was so unexpected, so contrary to human nature as most understood it, that many simply stood frozen in confusion. "He deserves everything he gets," shouted a young woman, her voice cracking with emotion. "You can't protect someone who tried to hurt you." Her sentiment was echoed by several others in the crowd, but there was less conviction in their voices now. James's intervention had disrupted the mob's rhythm and forced them to confront their own actions. Marcus stared at James, in absolute shock. Here was a man he had assaulted without provocation, bleeding from wounds Marcus had inflicted, and yet he was stepping in to prevent further violence. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, and Marcus felt his legs beginning to buckle under the weight of shame and disbelief. "Why?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the crowd's murmuring. "Why would you help me after what I did?" The question hung in the air, and even the most vocal members of the crowd fell silent, waiting to hear the guard's response. James looked directly at Marcus for the first time, his eyes filled not with hatred or anger, but with something Marcus couldn't immediately identify. "Because that's what soldiers do," James said simply. "We protect people, all people, even when they don't deserve it." The elderly veteran who had confronted Marcus earlier pushed his way through the crowd until he reached the front. His weathered face was still hard, but there was something different in his expression now. "Son," he said to James, "you're bleeding badly. You need medical attention." He turned to look at Marcus, and his voice took on a different tone. "And you need to understand what kind of man you just attacked." Emergency sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder as police and ambulance services responded to the multiple calls they had received. The crowd began to realize that official help was finally arriving, which seemed to deflate some of the vigilante energy that had been building to dangerous levels. A middle-aged nurse who had been in the Crowd pushed forward, ignoring the tension and focusing solely on James's medical needs. "I'm a registered nurse," she announced firmly. "This man needs immediate attention." She began examining James's head wound while speaking to him in professional, calming tones. The crowd's attention was now divided between the approaching sirens, James's medical condition, and Marcus, who remained at the center of everything but was no longer the singular focus of their rage. Some people began to step back, perhaps realizing that they had come dangerously close to becoming part of a mob that could have seriously injured or killed someone. James swayed slightly as the adrenaline that had been keeping him upright began to fade. The nurse steadied him while calling out for someone to bring water and clean cloths. "You need to sit down," she told him firmly. "You've lost a significant amount of blood." But James remained standing, his eyes still on the crowd and on Marcus. "Promise me," he said, his voice growing weaker but still carrying authority. "Promise me you won't hurt him when I'm gone." The request was directed at the crowd, but it felt personal to each individual present. The weight of James's request settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Here was a man who had been brutally attacked, bleeding from his wounds, yet asking his potential rescuers to show mercy to his attacker. The moral complexity of the situation was not lost on anyone present, and many found themselves questioning their own reactions and desires for revenge. Police vehicles rounded the corner with their sirens wailing, followed closely by an ambulance. The sight of official help arriving seemed to break whatever spell had held the crowd in its collective fury. People began stepping back, creating space, and some started to quietly slip away, perhaps uncomfortable with how close they had come to participating in mob justice. Marcus remained in the center of the gradually expanding circle, his body shaking uncontrollably. The alcohol that had fueled his initial aggression had long since been overwhelmed by adrenaline and terror. He looked at James, who was still standing despite his obvious injuries, and felt a crushing weight of guilt that was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The first police officers on the scene quickly assessed the situation, noting the injured guard, the agitated crowd, and the man who appeared to be at the center of the disturbance. Their training kicked in immediately as they began to establish control over what could easily become a dangerous situation involving dozens of witnesses and potential participants. "Everyone step back," commanded Sergeant Patricia Wells, a veteran officer with 15 years of experience handling crowd situations. "We need space to work." Her authoritative voice and confident demeanor helped establish the professional authority that the situation desperately needed. The crowd began to comply, though reluctantly. James finally allowed the nurse to guide him to a nearby bench where he sat heavily, the full impact of his injury beginning to take hold. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the confrontation and his protective intervention was fading, leaving him dizzy and nauseous from blood loss. Emergency medical technicians quickly took over James's care from the volunteer nurse, checking his vital signs and beginning to clean and assess his head, a wound. "We need to get you to hospital," one of them told him. "You've got a significant laceration and we need to check for concussion." Meanwhile, other officers had surrounded Marcus, who offered no resistance as they placed him in handcuffs. His earlier aggression had completely evaporated, replaced by a hollow-eyed stare and occasional mumbled apologies that no one could fully understand. The transformation from violent attacker to broken man was stark and unsettling to witness. "What exactly happened here?" Sergeant Wells asked the crowd, her notepad ready to record statements. Immediately, dozens of voices began speaking at once, each person eager to share what they had witnessed. The accounts were remarkably consistent. An unprovoked attack on a guard who couldn't defend himself, followed by the guard's shocking intervention to protect his attacker from mob justice. A tourist from Germany stepped forward, his phone in hand. "I recorded the entire incident," he said in careful English. "The man was drunk and angry about something. The guard never moved, never responded, even when he was being verbally abused. Then the man just attacked him with the bottle." He paused, shaking his head. But the strangest part was what happened afterward. The elderly veteran who had confronted Marcus earlier approached Sergeant Wells with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Officer, I served 30 years in the military and I've never seen anything like what that young guard just did. After being attacked, he literally stepped in to protect his attacker from us. He probably saved that man's life." As more statements were taken, a clearer picture emerged of both the initial assault and the dramatic intervention that had prevented what could have been a tragic escalation. Several witnesses specifically mentioned how James had broken protocol and potentially put himself at further risk to prevent vigilante justice. The paramedics were preparing to transport James to the hospital when he insisted on speaking to the police sergeant. Despite his obvious pain and disorientation, he was concerned about Marcus's welfare. "Officer," he said, his voice weak but determined, "I want to make sure that man receives fair treatment. The crowd was very angry and I'm worried about his safety." Sergeant Wells looked at James with a mixture of professional respect and personal amazement. "Sir, you're the victim here. Are you seriously concerned about your attacker's well-being?" When James nodded weakly, she shook her head in disbelief. "I've been doing this job for 15 years and I've never seen anything like this." Marcus was loaded into a police vehicle, but before the doors closed, he managed to catch James's eye one more time. Through tears and obvious emotional distress, he mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," repeatedly. James, despite his condition, nodded slightly in acknowledgement, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the watching crowd. As the ambulance prepared to depart with James, many of the witnesses remained behind, still processing what they had experienced. The initial anger had transformed into something more complex: admiration for James's character, shame at their own near participation in mob violence, and a lingering confusion about how to reconcile their desire for justice with the mercy they had witnessed. The teenage girls who had tried to help James approached Sergeant Wells, their faces still showing concern. "Will the guard be okay?" one of them asked. "He was so brave and he protected that horrible man even after being hurt." Her comment reflected the sentiment of many in the crowd, a mixture of worry for James and bewilderment at his actions. Social media was already buzzing with posts and videos from the incident. Multiple angles of the attack had been captured, but more importantly, several people had recorded James's intervention and his request for mercy. The footage was spreading rapidly, with comments ranging from outrage at the attack to amazement at the guard's response. A journalist who had arrived with the emergency services began interviewing witnesses, collecting quotes and reactions to what was clearly going to be a significant news story. "I've covered crime and violence for 10 years, she told her cameraman, "but I've never seen anything like this. The victim protecting his attacker from vigilante justice. It's extraordinary." The crowd began to slowly disperse as the immediate drama concluded, but many lingered, reluctant to leave the scene of something so profound and unexpected. Conversations continued in small groups, with people trying to make sense of what they had witnessed and what it meant about human nature, justice, and the power of individual moral courage. As the police vehicles departed with Marcus in custody, and the ambulance rushed James toward medical care, the physical evidence of the incident remained: broken glass on the pavement, bloodstains on the stone, and dozens of people who had been forever changed by witnessing both the worst and best of human behavior in the span of a few intense minutes. The hospital's emergency department buzzed with its usual controlled chaos, but the arrival of James Mitchell created an unusual stir among the staff. Word had already spread through social media and news channels about the Royal Guard who had protected his attacker from mob justice, and several nurses and doctors found themselves stealing glances at the young soldier as he received treatment. Dr. Sarah Chen, the emergency physician on duty, carefully examined James's head wound while asking routine questions to assess possible concussion. "You're incredibly lucky," she told him as she cleaned the laceration. "A few inches lower and this could have caused serious eye damage or worse. The thick material of your ceremonial hat likely saved you from a much more severe injury." James winced as the antiseptic solution contacted his wound, but remained stoic throughout the examination. His thoughts weren't on his own condition but on the events that had unfolded at the palace. "Doctor," he asked quietly, "have you heard anything about the man who attacked me? Is he safe?" Dr. Chen paused in her work, looking at James with undisguised amazement. "You're worried about him after what he did to you?" When James nodded, she shook her head in disbelief. "The police said he's being processed at the station. Physically, he's unharmed, though I understand he's quite distressed about what happened." Meanwhile, at the police station, Marcus Thompson sat in an interview room, his head in his hands, completely sober now, and fully aware of the gravity of his actions. Detective Inspector Michael Harrison sat across from him, reviewing the witness statements and video evidence that had been collected from the scene. "Mr. Thompson," Detective Harrison began, his voice professional but not unkind, "we have dozens of witnesses and multiple video recordings of what happened. The evidence against you is overwhelming. What I'm trying to understand is why you did it." Marcus looked up with red-rimmed eyes, his face pale and drawn. "I don't know," he whispered. "I mean, I do know, but it doesn't make it right. My girlfriend, she cheated on me, with my best friend. I found out 3 days ago, and I've been drinking ever since. I was just so angry at everything, at everyone. And that guard, he just stood there so perfectly, so controlled, and I hated him for it." The detective made notes while listening to Marcus's explanation. "So you took out your personal problems on a soldier who was simply doing his duty?" The question hung in the air, and Marcus nodded miserably. "The worst part," Marcus continued, his voice breaking, "is what happened after. That man, that soldier, he protected me. After what I did to him, he actually stood between me and that crowd. I could see it in their eyes. They wanted to hurt me, really hurt me, and he stopped them." Tears began flowing freely down Marcus's face. "What kind of person does that make me? What kind of man attacks someone like that?" Back at the hospital, news crews had begun gathering outside, hoping to interview James when he was released. Inside, James's commanding officer, Colonel David Whitman, arrived to check on his soldier's condition and to begin the process of understanding what had happened from an official military perspective. "How are you feeling, Mitchell?" Colonel Whitman asked, his concern genuine despite his formal demeanor. James had always been one of his most reliable soldiers, known for his dedication and level-headed approach to difficult situations. "I'm fine, sir," James replied, though the bandage wrapped around his head told a different story. "The doctor says I have a mild concussion and needed 12 stitches, but nothing that won't heal." He paused, then added, "Sir, I want to make sure that what I did out there doesn't reflect poorly on the regiment. I broke protocol when I left my position." Colonel Whitman studied James carefully. "Son, what you did out there, yes, you broke protocol, but you may have prevented a much more serious situation. The police told me that crowd was close to becoming violent. Your intervention likely prevented serious injury to multiple people, including your attacker." The story was spreading rapidly through news outlets and social media platforms. Video clips of the attack, followed by James's protective intervention, were being shared thousands of times per hour. Commentary ranged from outrage at Marcus's actions to amazement at James's response, with many people struggling to understand the moral complexity of what they were witnessing. Television news programs began reaching out to experts to help explain the psychological and ethical dimensions of the incident. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a professor of moral psychology, found herself fielding calls from multiple news outlets. "What we witnessed," she explained to one reporter, "challenges our basic assumptions about human nature and justice. The guard's response represents the highest form of moral courage, protecting someone who had just harmed him." At the police station, Marcus was informed that he would be charged with assault with a deadly weapon, a serious felony that could result in significant prison time. The news hit him like a physical blow, the full consequences of his alcohol-fueled rage finally becoming clear. "I want to see him," Marcus told Detective Harrison suddenly. "The guard. I need to apologize properly. I need to try to make this right somehow." Detective Harrison shook his head. "That's not possible right now, Mr. Thompson. He's receiving medical treatment, and even if he wasn't, there would be legal complications with you having contact with your victim before trial." Social media was exploding with debate about the incident. Some users expressed admiration for James's moral courage, while others argued that Marcus deserved whatever punishment the crowd might have given him. The hashtag, "You Are Royal Guard Hero," began, trending, with thousands of posts praising James's character and actions. Emma Roberts, a philosophy student at King's College London, posted a video essay about the incident that quickly went viral. "What we saw today," she explained to her camera, "is a perfect example of what philosophers call moral elevation, witnessing an act of such unexpected virtue that it inspires us to be better ourselves. That guard showed us what real strength looks like." Back at the hospital, James was finally cleared for discharge. As he prepared to leave, Dr. Chen handed him a card with her contact information. "If you experience any delayed symptoms from the concussion, headaches, dizziness, nausea, please don't hesitate to call. And Mr. Mitchell?" She paused, looking at him with deep respect. "What you did today, it's given a lot of people hope in humanity." As James walked toward the hospital exit, still wearing his blood-stained uniform, he could see the news crews waiting outside. The prospect of media attention made him uncomfortable. He hadn't acted for recognition or praise, but simply because it seemed like the right thing to do. Colonel Whitman walked beside him, preparing to help navigate the media circus that awaited. "Are you ready for this, son?" he asked. "This story is going to be everywhere, and you're going to be the center of attention." James took a deep breath, steadying himself against the wave of dizziness that the concussion still caused. "Sir, I just want people to understand that I was doing what any soldier should do, protecting people from harm, even when it's complicated." The automatic doors of the hospital opened, and James Mitchell stepped out into a world that had been watching and waiting to understand how one man's moment of moral courage could transform an act of violence into something approaching grace. The media scrum outside the hospital was unlike anything James Mitchell had ever experienced. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward his face, and reporters shouted questions over each other in their eagerness to get the first interview. With the man the internet was already calling the Guardian Angel Guard, Colonel Whitman positioned himself protectively beside James, helping to create a path through the crowd of journalists. "Guardsman Mitchell, how do you feel about being called a hero?" shouted one reporter. "Why did you protect the man who attacked you?" called another. "What was going through your mind when you saw the crowd turning violent?" The questions came rapid fire, overlapping and creating a cacophony of voices that made James's concussion-induced headache worse. James paused at the microphones that had been hastily set up, Colonel Whitman nodding his approval for a brief statement. The crowd of reporters fell silent, cameras rolling and recording devices capturing every word. "I'm not a hero," James began, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I'm a soldier, and soldiers protect people. That's what we do. It doesn't matter who they are or what they've done." "But he attacked you with a deadly weapon," pressed Sarah Williams from BBC News. "Surely you felt angry, wanted revenge." Her question reflected what many people were thinking. How could someone respond to violence with protection rather than retaliation? James touched the bandage on his head briefly, wincing slightly. "Of course I was hurt. Of course it was frightening. But anger and revenge don't solve anything. They just create more violence, more pain. That man was already suffering. I could see it in his eyes even before he attacked me. Adding more suffering wouldn't help anyone." Meanwhile, across London, Marcus Thompson was being released on bail pending his trial. The charges against him were serious. Assault with a deadly weapon could result in up to 7 years in prison. But as he walked out of the police station into the late afternoon sunlight, his thoughts weren't on his legal troubles but on the man he had injured and who had then saved him from mob justice. Marcus's sister, Helen, was waiting for him outside the station. She had driven down from Manchester as soon as she heard about his arrest, and her face showed a mixture of relief at seeing him safe and disappointment at what he had done. "Marcus, what were you thinking?" she asked as they walked toward her car. "Sarah cheating on you doesn't excuse attacking an innocent person." "I know," Marcus replied, his voice hollow. "I know it doesn't excuse anything, but Helen, you should have seen what happened after. This man, this soldier. I hurt him badly, and when the crowd wanted to hurt me back, he stepped in. He protected Me. Marcus stopped walking, overwhelmed by the memory. He could have let them tear me apart and no one would have blamed him. Instead, he risked himself again to keep me safe. The story continued to dominate social media and news cycles throughout the evening. Video clips of the incident had been viewed millions of times, with people around the world weighing in on the moral and ethical implications of what had occurred. Support for James was nearly universal, while opinions about Marcus ranged from calls for severe punishment to expressions of sympathy for someone clearly struggling with personal demons. Dr. Rebecca Martinez found herself booked on multiple television programs to discuss the psychological aspects of the incident. On the evening news, she explained to anchor Tom Harrison, "What Guardsman Mitchell demonstrated is what we call moral courage. The ability to do what's right even when it's difficult, dangerous, or goes against our natural instincts for revenge. It's extremely rare and represents the highest form of human ethical behavior." Social media influencers and celebrities began weighing in on the story. Actor Tom Hanks tweeted, "Sometimes humanity surprises us in the most beautiful ways. This young soldier showed us what real strength looks like. Our guardian angel guard, moral courage." The tweet was retweeted over 100,000 times within hours. At his small flat in Manchester, Marcus sat alone, scrolling through the social media coverage of the incident. Every video, every comment, every analysis piece reinforced the same truth. He had attacked a good man, and that good man had then saved him from the consequences of mob justice. The weight of shame was overwhelming, but it was mixed with something else, a determination to somehow make amends for what he had done. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed a number he had found through internet research. "Hello, is this the Royal Guard headquarters? I know this is unusual, but my name is Marcus Thompson. I'm the man who attacked one of your guards today. I need to find a way to apologize properly. I need to try to make this right." The duty officer who took the call was initially skeptical, but after verifying Marcus's identity, he was transferred to Colonel Whitman. "Mr. Thompson," the colonel said, his voice carefully neutral, "I appreciate your desire to apologize, but you understand, this is a very delicate legal situation. Any contact between you and Guardsman Mitchell would have to be carefully managed." "I understand, sir," Marcus replied, his voice cracking with emotion. I need him to know that I know what he did for me. I need him to know that his kindness hasn't been wasted on someone who doesn't appreciate it. I want to be better because of what he showed me." The conversation between Marcus and Colonel Whitman was brief but significant. It represented the first step in what would become an unprecedented situation. A victim and his attacker finding a way forward that focused on healing rather than punishment, understanding rather than revenge. Meanwhile, James was at home in his small military accommodation, trying to process the day's events while dealing with the constant ringing of his phone from reporters, well-wishers, and curiosity seekers who had somehow obtained his number. He had turned off his television after seeing himself on the news, uncomfortable with the attention and praise being heaped upon him. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Standing outside was Chaplain Robert Davies, a military chaplain who had served with distinction in Afghanistan and was known throughout the regiment for his wisdom and compassion. "Mind if I come in, son?" he asked gently. "Thought you might need someone to talk to after the day you've had." James gratefully welcomed the chaplain inside, and they sat together in his small living room. "I keep thinking about him," James admitted. "The man who attacked me, Marcus Thompson. I can't stop wondering what pain he was in that made him do something so desperate. And I keep thinking about how close that crowd came to really hurting him." Chaplain Davies nodded thoughtfully. "What you did today, James, it's changed people. I've been getting calls all evening from soldiers, from civilians, from people who saw the coverage and felt inspired to examine their own capacity for forgiveness and protection of others. You've shown them something they didn't know was possible." As night fell over London, the story of what happened at Buckingham Palace continued to reverberate around the world. It had become more than just a news story. It had become a catalyst for conversations about justice, mercy, moral courage, and the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest moments of human behavior. In separate locations across the city, two men, one a victim, one an attacker, were both fundamentally changed by their encounter. James Mitchell had discovered reserves of moral strength he hadn't known he possessed, while Marcus Thompson had been forced to confront the worst aspects of himself while simultaneously witnessing the best of humanity. The incident would continue to unfold in the days and weeks to come, but the moment that would be remembered forever was captured in those few minutes when one man chose protection over revenge, mercy over justice, and hope over despair. It was a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we retain the capacity to choose who we want to be.